welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. We're on location today at the new Minnesota History Center in St. Paul. We'll be watching a group of teachers from across the state who are participating in a hands-on workshop of Minnesota history. These teachers are using primary source material to get a sense of what daily life in Minnesota of 100 or 150 years ago was like. They'll be bringing their experience at the History Center back into classrooms across the state, helping children learn that history is real people, not just memorized names and dates. Talking about the project will be Phil Fitzpatrick, educational specialist from the History Center, Leslie Radloff, a teacher who's been involved in the program, and Chris Dodge from the Hennepin County Library.
Phil, I'm most interested in hearing from you something about where it is that children get their conceptions of history. And I'll put that in context of something that I've thought about, and that is popular mythology that gets passed along as history. And the example that I have in mind is George Washington and the idea that he chopped down the cherry tree and was contrite and said, "I cannot tell a lie." So if you would comment upon that, and also upon the role of teaching teachers.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, kids get their views of history from probably 2 or 3 major sources: their parents, TV, and their school teachers. And I should make a subset of the school teachers and include the textbooks that the school teachers use. Any one of those can be a really positive force for education, but unfortunately any one of those can also be a very negative force for education. And what we try to do at the Historical Society is to work with all 3 of those conduits of information about history to kids. We have programs for students, we have programs for school teachers, and we have programs for families, adults, families, parents. And we also published a textbook on Minnesota history. So we feel that our mission is to try and correct some of what you refer to as the mythology about history through a multi-faceted approach with the general public. I, as education specialist, when I create workshops for school teachers, one of which I'm in the middle of right now, where we're studying the fur trade, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. My mission is to create a format that allows teachers the chance to explore their own conceptions of history and break down some of the mythology that they may unconsciously be, or consciously. Some teachers really think certain things are true that in fact are either not true or are have been miscommunicated to them, and so they're more or less perpetuating the myths that you talk about. But in any case, what our workshops try to do is to give teachers access to primary sources at the Historical Society. In this fur trade workshop that we're in the middle of right now, what we're doing is exploring biographies of real fur traders. We're listening to both academic or scholarly people who have been studying the fur trade for many years, and we're also talking with Native American historians who have a slightly different view of how the fur trade impacted their culture. And by doing this with the 40-some teachers that we're working with, we're dispelling some of the mythology that has evolved over the years about the fur trade.
I think something that could be mentioned is that mythology does not necessarily entail untruths. It sometimes involves what truths are selected or focused upon.
Exactly.
And you mentioned that there will be some study of the Ojibwe views of the fur trade, and I, in reading about the workshops, noticed that there might be some people doing projects on the views of and roles of women during the fur trade.
Yes, that's been a very popular topic for some of our workshop participants. In fact, there are both elementary and secondary teachers that are studying that, and we had a very nice, informative and very exciting presentation by Audrey Wyman, who is a site interpreter at the Northwest Company Fur Post, and she typically dresses up as an Ojibwe woman. She is Ojibwe, but she dresses up as an Ojibwe from the 18th century. And she did this whole presentation as an 18th century Ojibwe woman, and she talked about the lifestyle at that time, and it was very, very informative. It exploded quite a bit of mythology and added a much more realistic perspective to what life was like then and how the fur trade impacted on their culture.
Right. It's certainly a broader perspective. It's been said that occasionally that history is written from the viewpoint of the victors, and this is an example of a way to open up the story and tell more of it.
Yes, the fur trade, since it was alive and kicking for 200 years and more, you have to assume that there were lots of facets that worked for people, and I think that's one of the things that we are trying to get at, is what worked in the fur trade. There was an obvious system that was in place for a longer period of time than any of our businesses that are alive today have been alive, and it's to open it up and pick out a topic in that 200-year period, like what Indian women's roles were. I think that it's safe to assume that most people assume that an Indian woman basically cooked and tended the babies in Ojibwe villages, but that's only a small percentage of the work that they did. They tanned the furs. They had a much stronger voice in decision making than is I think popularly known about. And so these kinds of awarenesses come out in a workshop like this, and they are immediately recorded either in a teacher's journal or in a teacher's project. And then we assume that from there they will go back into the classroom. And so kids learning about Native American culture in the 18th century begin to have a much better picture of what the truth actually was. And depending on, of course, on the age of the kid, I mean, you won't take a kindergartner or a first grader and talk to them about economic relationships between the Ojibwe and the fur traders. But in the secondary, whereas in a secondary class you might do that.
Right. So these teachers that are attending the workshops are arranged from elementary through high school?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually beyond high school. We have some graduate students, we have a community college teacher, we even have a couple of people who work with historic sites in Indiana. So we're getting people from not just the Twin Cities metro area, which is really exciting to me, because that's what I don't want to be metro based entirely. Mm-hmm. There is as much interest in the fur trade in War Road, Minnesota, per capita as there is in the Twin Cities area. So we're really excited to have people from all over the state, as well as a few people from out of state.
So what I hear you saying is that there's a sort of a modeling going on that just as teachers and other educators attending this workshop are being taught themselves, and the way that they're being taught is a way that they can turn around and teach something to students. I see behind me some material which I'm assuming, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is an example of from your workshop.
That's correct. We had an activity yesterday that was modeled by our history educator, Roberta Krim, who has been working for about 6 to 8 months on 4 lessons that will be offered to school groups starting in January 1993. This particular lesson is about the Ojibwa, and what she has done is to take the 5 different generations of Ojibwa, of an Ojibwa family that she has created, and so what the kids will do is to compare life in 1790 for the Ojibwa with life in 1965 for the Ojibwa, and 3 different levels in between. Yesterday what we did was we just explored the 1790 level, because that's the period of time in which we're largely focused in our fur trade studies. And Roberta handed out materials and introduced the activity, and then each of the people in the small groups would adopt the persona of one of the family members in that 1790 Ojibwa family, and so they learn about what life was like for that particular individual. If it was a young boy, the first time the boy picked up a bow and arrow and shot it, the grandfather and the grandmother in the family are involved more in teaching and in counseling and in decision making. The young man is maybe involved in trapping and trading. So and then what they do, of course, is they gather materials that Roberta provides and make a poster, essentially a poster. Now the kids will do a much more, we had to cut back because of time constraints, but the kids would be doing basically a 2-panel tabletop exhibit for each of the 5 generations. And then the whole school group will put their tabletop exhibits together, and they'll have the transition from 1790 through 1965 for this Ojibwa family, and it'll be like sort of a living family tree that will be visible to the whole class and to any guests that come into the classroom.
I think it seems to me like it would be effective, because it combines both writing, which I know is an important way for me to learn, that is to digest information that I've taken in either from a teacher or from reading, and then to manipulate it mentally and then do something with it in writing. In this case, I see first-person writings where students in the workshop are writing in the persona of various Ojibwe people, and then the graphic element I think is very important in education, because it is grabby and it's attractive, and that's an important element.
Yeah, the kids wind up being students and teachers simultaneously, because even in the very act of producing something like this, they are doing some teaching. Not only are they, as you say, adopting personalities and characters from a time period that they know virtually nothing about, but they're also learning and teaching. For instance, this crane right here, this represents this family, probably because of this particular crane here, belongs to the Crane clan, and we learned yesterday that there are 5 clans, and the Crane clan being one of them. And so this team, I guess, decided to convey that they belong to the Crane clan, and so we can I guess, assume that kids will be learning this information and then translating it onto their poster, and then in that way conveying it to their classmates and other guests that come into the classroom as well, and taking it home too. And we've come full circle, really. We're now talking about dispelling myths, and as you observed also, more importantly, expanding knowledge and expanding awareness of how history really was.
One last question that I'd like to ask ties in upon that, and that is, what is it about history that is relevant to children today? Why is history taught? I certainly sense that it's more than just facts about the past. This is the way it was, and these are your roots, which we sense that's important. But how do you see that history and how it's taught and how it's learned by kids impacts upon today and is relevant to kids in Minnesota?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and it's, I think, one that we try to keep uppermost in mind in programming here in the education department. If you're talking about mythology and dispelling erroneous myths or myths that are not complete, it's important, I think, for kids to have access to materials that have been well researched and that are presented in a creative way. And so what our view of creative way is making connections between what life was like in 1790, and what's changed, and also what has basically stayed the same in 1992. And kids can see that, and they can make connections if we as teachers and as educators provide them a way in which they can become involved and not be passive receivers. Mm-hmm. It's so much easier for a kid to understand how Indian life has changed and how it has stayed the same if they can play the role of an Indian in 1790 or 1840 or 1890. And they can begin to see what's changed and what has stayed the same. And in their own lives, we could adapt this kind of an activity to a Norwegian family. In fact, one of Roberta's lessons in January will be immigration, and she will be talking about lots of the cultures that have basically settled Minnesota after.
And that's a good example of an issue, a historical issue, which is alive today, of course. Immigration continues to be
sure.
Utmost importance.
Right, and Hmong families in St. Paul now are essentially trying to do the same thing that Scandinavian families were trying to do in the 19th century, which is basically learn about the environment, learn how they can fit in, and make a happy and contented life for themselves. And I think, you know, to finish up with your question, just to learn about history requires, I think, the ability on the part of teachers to get kids to put themselves in somebody else's shoes or moccasins or whatever clothing you want to talk about, and try and make some connections with their own lives. And that's how we sort of present history now. It's a living history, and it's based on primary sources, and it's based on giving as much of an access to those primary sources as possible, so that they can get a sense of what was true and what was maybe mythological.
Thanks, Phil.
Pleasure.
Now let's take a look at some classroom activities that are involved in this fur trade workshop.
Okay, just a quick description then of what they're going to do. Okay. The group here, this is designed primarily for grades 3rd, 4th through about 6th or 7th grade. And it's an activity that gets them to understand why hunting-gathering groups, as most early Native Americans were, why they lived in small groups and why they had to move periodically through the year. What they're going to be doing is collecting these wooden blocks, which represent various food types, and they have to get enough to survive. And by going through this, they'll understand the relationship of the numbers of people that can live in an area and the food supply that's available. So, if we have those 5 volunteers. Okay, again, just to refresh your memory, when I say go, run down, you pick up 2 blocks, any 2 blocks, bring back, put them end to end neatly on your rack. And I say neatly because, of course, the kids have a tendency to figure out, well, geez, if I just run this close and throw it at it, and then it's a shorter distance back. But they have to be end to end on the block so I can see how people are progressing, because that's important to when to say stop. Okay. Get out of the way here. Okay, go. Stop. Yeah.
Phil needs to write that and make
Okay, let's explain the colors here again on the rack. If the food blocks line up into the green, that means you got enough food to survive that week, no problem. If they only, say, came into the yellow, that means they had enough food to survive, but just barely. They're going to be slower the next week. And as you know, that means you have to hop, that slows you down. And in case you didn't notice, in the first time, usually the hoppers didn't last too long because they were much slower in gathering their food. Then, of course, in the red, that means they didn't get enough that week and they died of starvation. If you could share, we have a little extra here, we could give something to Phil so that he would be into the green. And
I started.
yeah, and yeah, into the green there too, that's right. There's enough that we can do that. So anyway, that's the basic gist of the game.
Yay.
Good.
Eye shaped holes and then use it as like tables and decoration all over like that. So they used, and kettle parts. I mean, at a lot of archaeological sites, historic sites, you'll find all these, because later on they didn't have the heavy, they used the thin tin metal. Yeah, because tablets were common. Women. They're used even now if you go to a powwow. The jingle dresses have large tinklers on and they jingle. So that tradition is just carried on, all this stuff. So they reused material a lot and made things that the traders, I'm sure, thought, what are they doing with it? And they
Ancient recycling.
Yeah, they just got European stuff and they decided, well, I'm going to use this way instead. The trader would never have predicted that they were going to use it in such a way. And there was a lot of that way. And this thing, somebody's messing with it.
What we're trying to do here, using modern 20th century technology and artifacts, is date some cultural periods based on a dig that was done. We have some clues that have been provided for us. The technological kinds of clues are through thermoluminescence, something or other, and carbon dating. So that gives us some idea of what period of time each of these levels represents, and so from there we're trying to break it down into more specific time period.
Right, they just bring bones. Well, what happens if, say, Uncle Fred dies in March, and you're going to be going to the mound burial site in late May, and you need to bury Uncle Fred. Uncle Fred's going to be an awful mess to try to, you might be bringing him hundreds of miles in a canoe. So, and there's historical accounts of Dakota people doing the same thing, where they would actually clean the flesh off the bones in order to transport the bones a long way.
And kettle parts, at a lot of metal, and they nested kettles, and they would cut them up and make tea.
As classroom teachers, then you're going to try this with your kids. Are you all elementary school or are you?
We're all secondary.
Secondary. So how will you integrate this into high school curriculum?
I'm not sure how I'm going to do it yet.
Maybe a month.
I don't know, but what it helps me with is it gives me a better understanding of what the process is, so that when things come up in the textbook, I can understand it better, to explain it better, but I don't know how I would do this yet in my classroom.
During the arcade.
As a community college instructor, it's a tremendous tool for teaching critical thinking, analysis, improving analysis abilities and skills, because you're taking historical evidence, pulling it all together and trying to make sense of it. So in terms of thinking skills, it's a tremendous activity.
I think it's also a good activity just for teaching the methodology of archaeology for high school level studies as well. It could be an introduction to something that a student might want to study at college level.
My students are ninth graders, and this is something that I could use in the classroom if I eliminate some of the ambiguity. There's difficulties in doing this for real, so I remove some of that and yet retain its correctness and authenticity, which I think you could do. I think you could use it in the classroom.
I'm talking now with Leslie Radloff, who I understand wears several hats, among them one of staff person at the Minnesota Historical Society, and more importantly now, as far as what I would like to talk about, is fifth grade school teacher and school librarian.
Right.
So fill me in on your perspectives as a teacher and librarian ties into these workshops?
Oh, the tie-in is very complete in my mind's eye. The materials and the activities are so useful in the classroom. They bring the little people to the children that you're teaching, and in a broader perspective of all of history, and takes what's happening on a small scale and makes it real to them. The activities.
The little people.
Yeah, the little people. You know, you and me, who we each have a story, and you can find individual stories in the different resources in the collection and take those out by copying and use them with the classes to show a bigger picture. And the kids like the activities. They're hands-on. They involve many different types of critical thinking skills and associations. And it's a lot of fun for the teacher, too.
Mm-hmm. And how about the library tie-in?
The library tie-in is that so many of the materials here from the manuscript collections with the journals and the photographs can be mirrored in literature, so that if you're looking at a journal from one of the fur traders or from one of the early settlers, you can find a companion piece in literature and contrast and find similarities there. And you can dispel some of the myths you were talking about with Phil by using the primary source versus the secondary source.
Do you find that your library is adequate in just using this example of the fur trade? I think of these economic times being such that libraries have, especially school libraries, and perhaps my thinking is stereotypical here, but represented by material that's out of date or not complete enough. And how do you remedy that?
You're right. School libraries have the same budget constraints as public libraries, only more so, I think. You can use those older materials and then take what you find here in the collections to supplement, to enhance, and to contrast. I was looking at an old book by May McNear that talked about the fur trade. In fact, I was looking at it last night, and she talked about the Métis, which were the children of the marriages between the voyageurs and the Native Americans, and thinking there are 2 pages in this book with old drawings, because it's from the 50s, that if I would use those 2 pages with the information that Audrey Wyman, who was one of the presenters in the workshop, gave, plus some of the writings of the Métis that are available, the students that I teach, or at an upper level, would have a much better idea of the Métis. Mm-hmm. And they would also see from where we came and how attitudes and presentations change and those types of things.
So you have to reach widely.
Yeah, and I think I have a really good network. I use the public library system a lot for materials we don't have at school, and come here a lot. The staff is very helpful when you're a classroom teacher looking for materials.
And you're speaking of the Historical Society.
Yeah, with their research collection and their photograph collection and their maps. It's vast.
I'm looking forward to visiting the Historical Society, the new building here, and I appreciate hearing your views as an educator and a librarian.
Thank you.
This approach makes history not only interesting but fascinating. Thank you, Phil Fitzpatrick from the History Center, Leslie Radloff, and Chris Dodge from the Hennepin County Library. Thanks to all of you for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.